Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Elizabeth McCarthy and I'm a radio producer and presenter and literary critic, and I'm also one of 5 judges for this year's Stella Prize. Welcome to this special event. It's great to see people out in Melbourne celebrating literature once again. I'd like to acknowledge tonight that we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to any First Nations people who are here with us tonight. This event is presented in partnership with the Wheeler Centre and the Stella Prize. And the Stella Prize is a major literary award celebrating Australian women and gender non-conforming writers. And Stella is an organisation that champions cultural change. In August 2020, myself and judges Jane Harrison, Tamara Zimmet, Ian C. and judges chair Zoya Patel began reading over 160 entries that were submitted for the 2021 Stella Prize. We were guided by Stella Prize Program Manager Daniela Baldry and Stella Prize Executive Director Jacqueline Bouton. As judges, we took great pleasure and pride in the process of critiquing the entries, and we recently decided on our long list and short list. And all details of the long list and the short list are up on the Stella Prize website, and I strongly encourage everyone in this room and everyone streaming at home to read the full long list and be dazzled by the strength, the power, the versatility and the excellence in the range of titles that have made this year's long list. Last week, it was announced that writer Evie Wyld is the winner of this year's Stella Prize for her novel The Bass Rock. With the support of Stella Prize major sponsors, the Wilson Foundation, Evie has been awarded $50,000, and I'm so rapt to be able to speak to her this evening about her winning novel. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Evie Wyld. She grew up in Australia and the UK, and she is part owner of Review, a small independent bookshop in London. Her first novel, After the Fire, A Still Small Voice, won the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize and a Betty Trask Award. In 2011, Evie was listed as one of the Culture Show's best new British novelists. She was also shortlisted for the Orange Prize for New Writers, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and the International Dublin Literary Award. In 2013, she was listed as one of Granta's best young British novelists. Evie's second novel, All the Birds Singing, was published in 2013. It was longlisted for the 2014 Stella Prize and the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, and shortlisted for the Costa Novel Prize and the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. She is the winner of the 2013 Encore Award, the Jerwood Fiction Uncovered Prize and the 2014 Miles Franklin Award for that particular novel. Her graphic novel with illustrator Joe Sumner, Everything is Teeth, was published in 2015. Her third novel, The Bass Rock, was published in 2020, and last week it won the 2021 Stella Prize. Hello, Evie, and congratulations.
Hello, thank you so much.
Let's just talk about the Bass Rock itself. It is situated in East Lothian, Scotland. I've been Googling it quite a bit. Tell us about why you set this particular novel in that place, Evie.
So it was a place I used to go as a kid. I had a great aunt who lived in the house that the Bass Rock is set in, which is this big old grand house with a ballroom and a piano and a view of the sea and a like deeply weird old money place. And she was this kind of really interesting woman who lived alone, and she'd had a stroke and she was part paralyzed, and pretty much the only thing she could say was lovely. So she said that about everything. And so for me, it was quite a weird place. You had to be very quiet in the house. And there was this wild landscape that had been papered over with a golf course. And North Berwick is it's sort of a British holiday seaside town. They've tried to make it pretty. And actually, you know, there's tar on the beach and there's gannets on the rock and they stink. And, you know, it's very rocky and very windy. so it always interested me as this, like, you know, the English trying to make something really wild, really tame. And then when my grandmother and my father died in quite quick succession, I inherited their photo album of my father's childhood, and there are all these photographs of him in front of the Bass Rock, you know, the same kind of pictures that I had of myself when I was a kid. And it did this sort of weird telescoping of time for me, that the rock is in the background looking exactly the same 60 years ago. And I went there when I was 8 months pregnant to do a bit of a recce, and it just, you cut out the golfers in their modern outfits, and it just looks exactly the same. So, and there's a history on North Berwick of witches women being accused of witchcraft, and there's still this old little church there called St Andrew's Old Kirk, which is where they were accused, and then they were executed in Edinburgh. So it's just this place that has a strange nostalgia for me, which is often where I start with my writing. I start with a place, and then I kind of add the people into it.
Well, speaking of people, I think that one of the wonderful aspects of this novel is that every character in the book, and there are many characters, so we have our three chief characters, but there are also many peripheral characters. They are all really interesting. And I can only imagine what it was like, Evie, to write this novel and to have to give some of these peripheral characters limited space so that you could, showcase the three chief characters. So please do tell us now about the three central women: Sarah in the 1700s, Ruth in the 1950s, and Vivian in a contemporary setting. Tell us about how you where these characters sprung from, and what you wanted to do with them and what you wanted to explore.
Well, I think when I sat down thinking, hopefully I'm now writing a novel, I had a new baby, so time was really, really squeezed, and I was just working in his naps, and so it turned out to be quite a handy thing, because I couldn't fret too much about it. I just had to write for an hour, and that's all I had. So there were originally probably about 13 more voices. I was just throwing an hour at it a day and then not thinking about it the rest of the time. But these three kind of stuck, and they felt like they were connected in some way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. So I think I started with Ruth, who's in the 1950s, because I was thinking of my grandmother, who follows a similar timeline to Ruth. She married an older man who had two grieving children, and she sort of took them on not very well, and lived in kind of strange, lonely places, never at North Berwick, but in similar English seaside towns. And by the time I knew her, she was an alcoholic, and she was desperate to be dead. And I saw her very much through the lens of my father, who hadn't enjoyed her as a mother. She was sort of fiercely intelligent, had never done anything really with her brain. And she was convinced that by the time she got to heaven, because she was fairly sure that was where she was going, she would meet up with my grandfather, who had died previously, and he would have already met up with his first wife, who died when she was young and beautiful and vivacious, and she sort of had this feeling of never living up to the first wife. And so I always kept her at arm's length. I found her a little bit scary and hard, and it was after she had died and my father had died that I saw these photographs of her being young, and she felt like she was so much more in her body. She was interacting and looking a bit sexy and interesting and a bit dangerous, and I started to imagine another version of her life for her. So that's sort of where Ruth started, and then she morphed very much into her own person. And I think Sarah in the 1700s, who's been accused of being a witch, I think, the witchcraft came in quite early because I had that link to North Berwick, and I wanted to think about how witch hunting has maybe not gone away. It's just changed shape, and we give it another name now. So I kind of wanted this quite fast-paced quest through the forest with Sarah. And also Sarah's section is told through the lens of a young man who's kind of, he's just turning into a man. He's just getting to the age where manly things are expected of him. And then Viv is a very, very thinly veiled version of me. So that sort of doesn't take all that much explaining. But I wanted a character who reached a certain age and didn't have any of those things that we see as evidence of a successful life. She doesn't have a partner in the beginning. She doesn't really have a job or children. She's not married.
So did you find that these characters really came fully formed to you, or did you really have to write into them?
Those three were pretty well formed, actually. I think their voices were there. I think my inner monologue is a mixture of Viv and Ruth, anyway. And so, it was really about kind of turning towards the things that I normally repress a bit, trying to walk towards the things that I felt really uncomfortable about in their voices. Really, I think with Viv, it's quite, she can be quite self-lacerating. So yeah, I think, and then I've got all of, there are sort of what get described as intervals of murder throughout the book. And those were a lot more tricky to pin down. They were somehow, I've got a whole folder of murders that didn't make it into the book, and they kind of needed a bit of a shape to them. So with such short pieces, it's quite hard to make them all different enough that it's not just a relentless kind of dirge of death. So that was sort of a tougher problem.
I imagine too that the passages involving Viv allowed some lightness to come into your writing as well, because I mean what we've sort of described and heard about tonight so far makes the book sound incredibly grim, but there is some sardonic moments, some laugh out loud moments, I would say, and I think that Viv is perhaps a vehicle to let that light into the novel overall. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I can't imagine writing a book without funny moments, and also the worst moments of life are normally the funniest. Everyone's trying not to laugh at a funeral. It's just our way of coping, and it's such a weird thing. Life is so strange, death is so strange. And I think something that I see in my peers is that, if you are in a situation like Viv is in, when you, like, things are not going well, the way to cope is to turn it into a kind of almost like your life into a sitcom. And within that, I also wanted to explore a sort of rom-com idea that, Viv does meet this young man, this man, and the expectation of what's going to happen is that he's going to somehow make her complete, and she's going to, look after him or whatever. And I really wanted to explore that. And I think there's a lot of, romantic comedies are enjoyable to watch because they're funny and because, it's this simplified, boiled down version of people. And I really wanted to have some fun with that, and then just sort of extinguish it quite simply.
That's exactly what she does. You totally did. You stole us. You stole that rom-com away from us. I'm curious too about, so the novel, as we've talked about, is set in Bass Rock or near Bass Rock, and the house in which this novel is set is really a character in itself. So, and there are so many great sort of overbearing, haunting and mysterious houses in literature's Gothic traditions. And so this house is the site of Ruth's unhappy marriage. It's where Viv goes to retreat from the world, but also she's renting the house for sale. Could you talk about the house and how you decided to embellish it with hugeness and loneliness and ghosts and objects that Ruth, when she's having fits of despair, could just smash, because the house functions as a character.
I think because I spent a lot of my childhood in that house, and it's a spooky house, with just one woman rattling around in it. It always stuck in my mind as A, haunted, and B, just enormous. So I guess within that, that sort of Gothic without me even trying. And I think the chintz of an English life is so interesting. The kind of little ceramic dogs and cottages and vile little things that they collect. My grandmother, who Ruth is based on, once told somebody that she liked pigs, and so as a result her house was completely cluttered with ceramic pigs. And she was a chain smoker, and she'd be like, "Another pig, darling," kind of. It was, I think, there's so much in the objects in that house that is about the stuff that's unsaid. And so when Ruth feels anger, she starts to break the often wedding gifts, and she goes about it quite systematically. And I think for me that feels like a 1950s version of self-harm, which is kind of my generation's anger. That's how a lot of my generation's anger came out, through cutting or slapping and stuff like that. And I think it's almost like things are getting closer to the edge. Things are any minute now, any generation now will actually be able to speak about what's making us angry and do something about it. But it feels like it's rising.
There's something too kind of gratifying as a reader about how Ruth smashes one of the ornaments in the house. It's sort of, we feel a sort of catharsis that I imagine she would have felt doing it. One of the aspects too of the house is ghosts, and this is a novel that has ghosts in it, and the judging panel was so impressed by the way you wrote the supernatural into this story, Evie. And I can't imagine ghosts are easy to write, because one of the things about ghosts is they're also kind of hilarious and a bit kooky, and there's a sort of a long line of ghosts just being sort of silly make-believe features of stories. So how did you write a ghost that had integrity?
I think so first of all, I love reading about ghosts. I love writing about ghosts. I don't believe in an afterlife, but I do believe that people experience ghosts, and what are they? So Sarah's ghost is based very much on a ghost that made me move out of my last flat, which is an embarrassing thing to admit. But it was one of those situations where I was very sleep deprived and recently lost my father, like lots of big life stuff going on, and was feeling like I was losing myself a lot. And but the sleep deprivation is probably the main thing, because that can make you hallucinate. And I didn't ever see anything, but what I did do was feel something, and then I could imagine so strongly a person I'd never seen before standing in a particular way, doing particular things. And my son, you know, babies are nightmares for seeing ghosts. That's like having, you know, a dog on steroids. And he would be waving at someone all the time, or like staring deeply into a mirror, but not at himself, at something behind him. So there was also a swarm of bees. Like there was a lot of stuff that I'm quite comfortable with saying, you know, it wasn't a dead person floating around, but it was something that I was experiencing, and also that my husband was experiencing, that made us leave. So there are a lot of family ghost stories in my family as well. My parents fled from a poltergeist in France, and you know, or something that we call a poltergeist. And I think there's so much about it which is fascinating and says so much about the person experiencing the ghost, the trauma that they're going through, or the worries that they've got. And I'm fascinated by what that could be and what it can mean. And I'm never that interested in the neat ghost story. I don't want something that's explained. You know, it's like I watch a lot of horror, and I could almost always switch off 3/4 of the way through and not see the ending. I'd be very happy with that with most horror movies, because the human need to wrap things up in a bow and, you know, make Tim Curry's clown into a giant spider is so disappointing. You know, it's like Tim Curry as a clown is the single most frightening thing in the world. We don't need to know why he's a clown. And as soon as they get human desires and needs, as soon as Tim Curry as a clown needs to feed on the tears of children, it's like, I need to feed on the flesh of a chicken. So we're kind of the same. It's a weird answer.
Oh dear. So these ghosts, well, there's one ghost in particular, but at one point there's several ghosts at a certain point in the novel in this house. The central, if I can call it the central ghost, has, you know, experienced violence and menace, and women's experiences of violence and menace and feeling threatened, being spoken down to, being raped, living with the fear of violence, and living in the context of menace. These are not unusual experiences. This is part and parcel of the dailiness of life for a lot of women, for most women. These are lived experiences of so many of us. And it's an absolute outrage that it is. And there's a universality and timelessness about these experiences. Had you been reflecting on that long before writing this particular novel? And, you know, could you talk about that informing so much of the novel? It's sort of the overarching theme, isn't it, of the novel, is the violence that's done for centuries against women, and the abuse that we've suffered and been, you know, at the hands of men.
Yeah, I think my first two novels were really circling this one in a funny way. My first book, After the Fire Still Small Voice, is from the point of view of two men, and it's about the I guess it's about the toxic masculinity that's laid on top of them, and how they're not able to communicate with each other. It's a father and son, and one's experienced his parents at war, and then he's experienced the Vietnam War, and then there's the third boy who hasn't had a war but has got the trickle down effect. And then the next book, All the Birds Singing, is about a woman who's been brutalized and living on her own and dealing with her guilt and the demons, and so this felt like, sort of, every time I finished a book, I kind of had this feeling of, it's not quite what I meant to say. It's in the ballpark, but it's not quite what I was going for. So I sort of touched on it before, that this book was about going towards things that made me uncomfortable. and that I knew would make other people feel uncomfortable. And so whenever I was writing something and thinking, this feels a bit too much, too loud, and too in your face, and there's too much, some of the comments about the book have been like, oh, it's like every man in the book is this evil nightmare. And I don't think that's true for a start. But I also think that when you come back to the idea that every single woman has experienced something like this, and if they don't think they have, and they look back on their life, they'll find it there. There have been a lot of we had a young woman called Sarah Everard murdered here last month, and by a police officer. And one of the things that it has done is it's kind of unlocked this mass trauma of women remembering stuff that they hadn't really put in their brain as important, but it's sort of thinking about the first time that something happened to them. And for most of us, it's around 6 or 7, and then it could progress yearly. You could probably find something in every year, whether it's being a schoolgirl and being masturbated on the underground, or being snogged by a parent's friend, or being tickled, overly tickled, which is a bugbear of mine. So I think, for me, it was about facing those things head on and not listening to the voice in my head that was telling me to be polite and quiet and tone it down. It was about ramping it up, really.
I think all girls, I guess I'm generalising saying this, but I think all girls are aware from a very young age. Sort of when we're 3, to be wary of strangers, and those strangers are always men, aren't they? And to sort of always be clocking fear and be clocking strangers, and that something bad will happen to you. I wanted to actually, something you just mentioned before was someone said that all the male characters in this novel are terrible, and they're not. Chris and Michael in particular, they're little boys when we first meet them. And through these characters, children, you explore, I think, what patriarchy does to little boys, and what institutions and systems do to little boys. Could you sort of expand on that, about that oppression and control that Michael and Christopher are under when they're children?
Well, so they are, I kind of took their timeline again from my dad and my uncles, who were sent off to boarding school at 8 years old. And, it was a very upper class British boarding school. And so it was very into corporal punishment, very into a hierarchy of, you get beaten up, or, you basically, your parents are paying for someone to take you away and do whatever they want to you. And I think, all of my uncles are charming, lovely people who have been so damaged by that moment in their lives where they're just sort of not even abandoned, but somebody's gone, take a lot of money to take these guys away. And there's a scene in the book which is almost directly from my father's mouth, where he's talking about a time he almost, I can say this now because he's dead and no one's going to arrest him, he almost killed someone on a train because he looked up and it was his old housemaster who had at one time brutalized him so horrendously when he was about 9, that he'd never, he clearly never got over it. And that moment where he saw him on the train and wanted to push him off, and he always regretted not doing it, because he imagined the response of all of the boys who had been brutalized by this man, who was clearly damaged himself from whatever war he fought in, from whatever childhood he'd had. And it's sort of it's really in the grain of everything, this horrendous treatment of children, male and female.
I'm also curious about your use of Sherelle Moody's project, the Australian Femicide and Child Death Map. I saw you tweet last week after you won the prize about that particular project. Yes. Sherelle Moody is a journalist. She's an award-winning journalist who's put together this project. Could you talk about the project, Evie, and the impact it has had on your writing?
Yeah, so Sherelle Moody put together a sort of interactive map of Australia, and it's got, if you look it up, it's got all of these red hearts all over it, and each heart represents a murdered child or woman. And what Sherelle does is she tries to get as much information about each person as possible. Sometimes there's a photograph and a name and a date of birth and a little section about who they were. But often it's just unknown female, which is really, really chilling. And I think something about that map linked my voices together and made me really want to think about, who was with those women when they died, apart from the obvious, apart from the person who ended their lives. I think that sadness of it being totally unwitnessed and then being totally alone in this huge moment, these last moments of their life, it just felt like this massive malign presence, over the whole of the globe, that there's this thing that is killing women, and it's not an isolated incident with no further threat to the public. It is this huge swathe, this blanket of witch hunting. So I think Sherelle Moody's map really kind of pinpointed what I wanted to do. And there's a moment in the book where Maggie, who is a sort of slightly witchy woman in the present day, she talks about what if every single woman who had been murdered by a man was visible all at once, and this idea of walking in and out of the death zone, where something has happened to someone, and I suppose coming back to ghosts again, the kind of echo of their lives and their deaths. And it really spoke to me about what I wanted to do.
One of the things about the character of Maggie is she's one of the most compelling characters in the book, and as you said, she's kind of befriends Viv in contemporary life, and she is semi-homeless. But she sometimes works as a sex worker. But she also has this freedom about her where she kind of moves through the world like a man with this sort of, she has very little fear, Maggie. Could you talk about putting her in the novel? Because she's kind of just intervenes in Viv's life, doesn't she? She sort of just comes out of nowhere one night at a 7-Eleven.
Yeah, I think Maggie is, I was thinking about what is a witch, and it's just, you are a witch if you say you're a witch. And, that was kind of my thinking about Maggie, and like you said, she moves through the world like a man. And one of the things that being a witch means to her is listening to intuition. So she, we all get those moments where our stomach drops and we know that something is wrong, and we couldn't put a name to it. We couldn't say what we've picked up on. And because we've been taught all our lives as women to be polite and not make a fuss, more often than not, we ignore it. And Maggie doesn't do that. She listens to it. And that is how she is able to move around like a man. She is accepting of those things about herself, her innate witchiness. And I think I really wanted to tread a line with her that she's sort of the most annoying person on earth as well. She's sort of brilliant, but also on the edge of a pixie dream girl kind of nightmare. But she is just, what that means is that she is very, very alive and very present in her own life. And she's a way of, she's got a self-belief, I suppose. She's got a way of moving through the world like she matters, and using her body in a way that benefits her.
One of the things you canvass in the novel is institutional abuse. So several of the women in the novel have actually been treated or are being treated in psychiatric facilities. In the case of Ruth, she's actually been gaslighted by her husband to be committed. So he's suggesting that he will commit her if she remains uncompliant on the domestic front. And one of the characters in the book will never recover from her treatment. Others are coping with the shame and guilt of being treated. And I'm really curious about the research you did to investigate the historical treatment of women in psychiatric facilities.
Well, actually, funnily enough, there's a case of a woman called Maggie in Scotland who they were still doing in the 1970s lobotomies, but they essentially would go into your brain with a soldering iron and like sort of smudge out the bits that they didn't like. And there are these incredible videos of her. She was a mother of 5, and the reason that she was committed was she'd started to become violent, not towards her children, but towards other people. And I think, having a young child at the point that I was reading about her, I recognized how, you think that you have a baby and everything is flowers and life and springtime, but actually I've never thought so much about death and imminent death and danger. And I've never felt so angry at other people for like being near me and the threat that they could cause to my kid. And so she made so much sense to me that she had 5 of them, and so she was just like wigging out about what awful thing is going to happen next. And I think that's quite a common thing. You're thinking about terrible deaths that will befall this thing that is now your heart kind of going off on its own. And so she made a lot of sense to me. And then in the video of her, it's a color video, which is really startling, and she's sat down on a little chair very meekly, holding her handbag in her lap. And then there's a doctor in a white coat leaning up against his desk with his arms folded, talking down to her very literally and telling her that, now Maggie, we're going to do something for you because you're not having a nice time, are you? And you're putting people in danger, aren't you? And talking in this deeply patronizing way, like she's a toddler. And she's just there so shrunk by him and agreeing to everything he says. And then they show the surgery, and in the surgery she is screaming about how she's awake, and she's screaming about how they're doing this thing to her and she doesn't want it. And it's just the most upsetting, disturbing thing that she's been coerced into agreeing to this thing. This thing is done to her, and then afterwards she can't speak for years. She can barely walk, and she gradually gets a bit of movement and a bit of language back. And then she became this terrific advocate for, consent around those kind of treatments. So that was really where my thinking about institutions came from, and just how coerced women are into treatments, and how it's the same as everything else, really.
That's an incredible story. So We've got about 15 minutes left, Evie. So I'm really curious about tone and structure of this novel. So let's talk about tone first of all, because one of the things that really impressed myself and the judging panel, one of the things we marvelled over was how the novel's tone flips depending on which point of view is being told in this story. So the sections featuring Sarah in the 1700s are written in a formal tone that's reminiscent of stories written centuries ago, and you've written Ruth's sections in the 1950s in a tone that's in keeping with quite uptight social and domestic formalities of that era. And Viv's sections are written in a far more looser and contemporary tone. So tell us about making the decision to write these sections in very different tones, because to me, that is where the novel could have fallen over if those tones were not cohesive and if they were too clunkily sort of joined. But tell me about, and tell the audience about those decisions about tone.
I think, the tone was a big worry to me, especially with the 1700s one. I was really anxious about not producing a sort of Witchfinder General sort of tone, and there's so much of that about. I think actually, funnily enough, the closest I could link it to was in my first book when I was writing about the Vietnam War, and there's so much pop culture about it that it's really hard not to fall into, napalm and choppers and the sort of psychedelia, the American experience of it. And what I did with that book was I just went, right, well, it's one man's experience. And so that's kind of what I did with the 1700s. I sort of followed what Jim Crace, who wrote Harvest. He talks about how important it is to do like quite minimal research, and being a lazy person, I absolutely agree, that if you research is so enjoyable. You always want to be like, oh, I have to now unfortunately research cannibals for 3 to 4 years and I can learn everything about them, and watch loads of movies and stuff. But actually what happens is you end up crowbarring in facts, little factoids and fascinating things, and that's not what storytelling is. So, and I did the same thing with sheep in my second book, that I didn't know anything about sheep, and I kind of needed to know a lot, but not what books could tell me. I needed to go after I'd written it and stay on a sheep farm and ask the farmers, like, what do you eat for breakfast? And stuff like that. So I did the same sort of thing with Sarah's part, that it was important to try as much as possible to keep the language in fitting with the time, but not overdo it. And also, not crowbar in facts about 1700s and keep the date quite loose, because in reality, by the 1700s, there wasn't a lot of witch hunting going on, but this is like a little rural town, and it's kind of about hoping that the reader will just sort of go, all right, we're with you, and go with you. And then I think the thing that I find hardest of all is writing about a time and place that I'm in now. So Viv really was the trickiest one, because I didn't want it to be exactly my voice. She's not exactly me, but she thinks in a similar way to me. So in a way, that's the hardest. And you've got to contend with things like mobile phones, which are often the wrecker of all tension, and kind of pop culture, which is hard to kind of steer away from. And one of the reasons that, again, I went into that rom-com idea, that it was a way of looking at this point in time through the lens of pop culture, but without it kind of ironing out all of the possibilities for imaginative ghosty monsters and stuff.
That's really interesting because one of the things that strikes me about this novel is, as much as I've talked and asked questions tonight a lot about setting and about the house and objects, it's actually not description heavy, this novel. It's very character driven. And so with Viv, you describe sort of very much what her actions are, what her body's doing, you know, what she's sort of doing from minute to minute, but you're not necessarily describing you know, what the house it looks like at that particular time. And because obviously you're setting it in this incredible place, but I think to your credit, it's not, there's not passages and passages of, like, you know, the glorious rural sort of landscape that you've set it in. Was that a conscious decision not to sort of labour how extraordinary the wilderness is there?
I think my writing is heading more and more towards a kind of cleaner aspect. I think everything I write now, I want to move the story along with, and I'm not really interested in the beauty of it. I think when I started writing my first book, there was very much this idea of, like, you can write anything as long as it's beautiful, and I don't think you can. I think if you've got a passage that is just rhapsodizing on a landscape, you might as well do a painting or take a photograph. And I'm a big believer in leaving gaps for the reader to put their own information into. I think that's one of the really exciting things about reading and writing, is that everybody who reads the book, even though they're reading the same words, they'll have a totally different picture of what it all looks like and what it all means, depending on their life experience. And that is an integral part of the process of writing for me, to leave gaps where there's ambiguity, and, you know, it fills in. And for some people that's a nightmare. But it's the kind of book that I enjoy reading, that I'm not being told stuff, I'm figuring it out myself.
And I'm also curious about, I mean, I sort of have this image in my head of this book, when you're drafting it, being quite the sort of jigsaw in terms of where particular sections go, you know, who gets to speak and when, because as we've discussed, it's very much told in particular sections by particular people. So how did all that, I mean, was it a complete nightmare trying to make the whole thing join up? Could you talk us through that process?
Yes. Yeah, it's always a nightmare. I work in such a messy way. I start somewhere in the middle, and then I, like, spider out, you know, up and down and both and left and right, and then there's normally a point for about 6 months from the end where I print it all out and try and work out what order it should go in to best tell the story. And that normally involves chucking out a load of stuff, because once you are fixed on a structure, you kind of have to keep to it. So yeah, it is very much like a maths equation at some point. And every time I start a novel, I'm like, right, well, this is going to be the one that starts at the beginning and ends at the end, and it's going to be just straightforward telling, and it's all going to be nice and easy. And then there's always a point where it's just like, it's just not how my brain works. I think for me, so much comes together in the last year of writing, and it's about getting lost in it and writing way too much and going off in way too many directions, and finding your way out of that sort of labyrinth is the structuring, and is the way that it turns into a novel. And it's not just a load of incoherent, nightmarish whooping.
And to what extent are you getting feedback from editors in those final drafts? Are you sharing it?
Yeah, I've got my husband's my first reader, because he's an editor. We met doing a creative writing course, so I feel like we're not divorced yet. And then I show it to my agent to make sure I'm not insane and that it's not going to upset my editor. And then I send it to my editor. So normally there are maybe 2 drafts go to the editor, I think. And what they're really fantastic at is it's not there is a line by line editing situation that comes on about punctuation and word choice and stuff, but really it's about asking the right questions, and that's what my editors are great at. They're just like, do we think Viv would do this here? They're very politely kind of make like an eel through it. So I think, yeah, I feel like they're very, very important, but I don't bring them in until the book is somewhere close to finished.
And just before we wrap up, I thought I'd ask you about well, two things. First of all, the impact of literary prizes on your career and on your creativity, because you've won a lot, you've had a lot of acclaim, a lot of notice right from the get-go of your first book. Could you talk about the impact of that? As I sort of flagged at the beginning of the session, there's it's quite the CV, Evie. So talk about those literary prizes and the impact that all that's had on your confidence and creativity.
I won the John Llewellyn Rhys for my first book, and that was £5,000, I think. And that really, I look at that as that's how I wrote my next book. That was it's quite hard out there, and there are so many books and so many brilliant books. It's as the confidence thing. I don't think you ever feel like you're always feeling like an imposter. There are so many thousands of fantastic books that could just as easily have won and deserve to win. So every time you win something, there is that little thing of like, maybe it's better not to have won it, but I don't know, to feel kind of, I don't know, brought along with a long list or a short list or something. But you were always a bit like, do I really deserve this? I don't know. It seems weird. I do a very selfish thing. I lock myself away and write stories. It seems weird to be given a prize for that. But I do think that, especially in the year that we've just had, where women's work is so marginalised with housework and childcare and everything, this year to me felt like an incredible one to win this award, to win the Stella on, because it's so about women and non-binary writers' work. It shines a light on it in a way that that perhaps other prizes don't, and it's been such a supportive one as well. You really feel like there's a team of people behind you. So for me, like, this has been like the win of my career so far. It's just been lovely.
Oh, how fantastic to hear that. Look, I can report being part of the team in the past 8 months, just what a supportive experience it's been, that Daniela and Jacqueline from the Stella Prize have made just for the judges alone. But, and you saying that as a winner is just wonderful to hear. Could we ask, given COVID was on last, has been sort of thwarting a lot of us for the last 12 months or so. Could you please talk about what you're working on now, Evie? And I'm curious about whether COVID has impacted the types of things you're writing about and the types of things that are inspiring you in writing.
I'm sure it has, but I don't know how to recognize that until I've finished it. I think maybe there'll be I'm certainly not someone who is any good or interested in writing about like current affairs, even though the Bass Rock seems to be something that we're all talking about at the minute. It's because we have been thinking about it for so long. But so really what I'm writing a sort of much more straightforward ghost story, touch wood, again, that will start at the beginning and go straight to the end, hopefully. But I sort of wanted to write something that's a bit smaller, a bit more focused on just a relationship, and really kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of just 2 people. That's my plan, but it's very early days, and I'm sure it will blow up and turn into a giant mess.
Well, we can't wait to see what you produce next. And it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you for the last hour, Evie Wyld. And once again, congratulations on winning the 2021 Stella Prize. Please give Evie another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I should mention tonight that we have Neighbourhood Books up the back who have many copies of the Bass Rock, Evie's award-winning book, to sell you. So please make yourself known to Neighbourhood Books up the back. And thanks everyone for coming out this evening, and for those who are streaming at home, happy reading of the 2021 Stella Prize winner. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.